169 DC. He was alone now. Lucius was dead. The co-emperor who had shared the throne for 8 years, who had taken the Eastern War, who had celebrated the triumph, who had been the other half of an arrangement that Marcus had designed specifically because he believed no single man should bear the weight of Rome alone, was buried in the mausoleum of Hadrian. Marcus Aurelius was 50 years old. He had been emperor for 8 years. He had managed a war in the East, a plague that had killed millions, a Germanic invasion that had reached Italy itself, and the death of his brother. He had done all of this from Rome, from the administrative center of the empire, surrounded by the machinery of governance. Now he was going to the front. Not because he wanted to. He had never wanted military command. The meditations contain no celebration of battle, no glorification of war, no trace of the martial enthusiasm that drove lesser Roman emperors to campaign for the pleasure of it. He went because the situation required it, because the Germanic coalition was not breaking, because the frontier needed an emperor in the field, not a philosopher in a palace. He packed his books. He took his writing materials. He took his philosophical correspondence. He took, into the military camps of the Danube frontier, the interior life that 15 years of Stoic practice had built, the only part of himself that the empire could not requisition, could not deploy, could not consume. And for the next 11 years, he fought a war he didn't want while writing the most important philosophical text of the ancient world. He spent 11 years on the Danube frontier. He fought the Marcomanni, the Quadi, the Sarmatians. He negotiated, campaigned, and managed the largest military operation Rome had seen in a generation. And every night he wrote the Meditations. This is the episode about what it costs to be both a philosopher and an emperor at the same time. Subscribe, like the video, and let's get into it. The Danube frontier in the 2nd century was not a line on a map. It was a living system. A network of forts, watchtowers, supply depots, river patrols, diplomatic relationships with client tribes, and the accumulated institutional knowledge of generations of frontier commanders who understood that the border between Rome and the Germanic world was maintained not by walls but by constant, exhausting attention. The Marcomanni and Quadi had broken that attention. They had crossed in 166 while Rome was distracted by the Eastern War and the plague. They had reached Aquileia, besieged it, raided deep into the Italian peninsula. They had demonstrated, to every Germanic tribe north of the Danube, that the frontier was permeable, that the Roman military machine, for all its weight and organization, could be pushed. Marcus arrived in 169 to push back. He brought with him the best generals available, men who had served under Statius Priscus and Avidius Cassius in the east, who understood Roman military doctrine at its most sophisticated level. He brought reinforced legions, rebuilt after the plague had decimated their ranks. He brought the administrative intelligence that 15 years of governance had given him, the understanding that wars were won not just on battlefields but in supply chains, in the management of conquered populations, in the diplomatic relationships that turned enemies into clients. He also brought something no previous Roman field commander had brought to the Danube: a philosopher's patience. The Germanic wars were not going to be won quickly. Marcus understood this before he arrived. The Marcomanni were not the Parthians. They had no cities to sack, no capital to threaten, no single point of political gravity whose capture would end the war. They were a tribal coalition spread across hundreds of miles of forest and river valley, capable of dispersing and regrouping faster than a Roman army could pursue them. The only way to win was to outlast them. Marcus was very good at outlasting things. The Meditations were written here. Not all of them. The text shows evidence of composition across decades, fragments written at different times and in different circumstances assembled into a single document. But the bulk of what survives, the core of the philosophical project, was written on the Danube frontier during the Germanic Wars. Book 2 of the Meditations begins with the words, "At Carnuntum." Carnuntum was a Roman legionary fortress on the Danube in what is now Austria. It was Marcus's primary base of operations for much of the Germanic campaign. The fact that he noted the location at the start of a book of private philosophical reflections tells you something about the relationship between the military reality and the philosophical practice. They were not separate activities conducted in separate parts of his life. They were simultaneous. The same man in the same place doing both at once. What he wrote was not abstract. The meditations are full of the specific texture of military life. The noise, the discomfort, the proximity to death, the difficulty of maintaining philosophical equanimity in conditions that were designed to erode it. He wrote about waking up unwilling to face the day and instructing himself to get up anyway, because the work was there and the work needed to be done. He wrote about the temptation to be angry at the people around him and the instruction to remember that they, like him, were doing the best they could with what they had. He wrote about death, repeatedly, obsessively, with the specific focus of a man who was watching it happen around him at a scale that the philosophical texts had not quite prepared him for. He was not performing stoicism for an audience. He was using it to survive. The Germanic wars were not a single campaign. They were a series of campaigns spread across 11 years, each one addressing a different aspect of a military problem that kept reconstituting itself. The first phase, 169 to 175, focused on pushing the Marcomanni and Quadi back across the Danube and re-establishing the frontier. This involved pitched battles, siege operations against fortified positions in Germanic territory, and the systematic destruction of the logistical networks that allowed the Germanic coalition to maintain pressure on the Roman side of the river. Marcus proved to be a competent military commander. This surprises people who know him primarily as a philosopher. It should not. The Stoic training that had shaped his entire adult life was, among other things, a training in decision-making under pressure, in maintaining clarity of thought when circumstances were designed to produce panic, in identifying what was actually in your control and focusing your energy there rather than dissipating it on things that couldn't be changed. These are military virtues as much as philosophical ones. He was calm in crisis. He was methodical in planning. He listened to his generals without being controlled by them, which was the specific skill that distinguished effective Roman emperors from ineffective ones. He was physically present at the front in a way that mattered to the legions, not leading charges which would have been foolish but visible, accessible, sharing the discomfort of campaign life rather than observing it from a comfortable distance. The legions respected him. Not with the passionate loyalty that charismatic commanders like Julius Caesar had inspired. Marcus was not that kind of commander. With something quieter and more durable, the respect that soldiers give to a leader who is doing an honest job honestly. 172 DC. There is an episode from the Germanic Wars that the sources record in multiple versions, that appears on the column of Marcus Aurelius in Rome, and that reveals, in its competing interpretations, exactly what Marcus Aurelius meant to his contemporaries. During a campaign against the Quadi in 172, a Roman unit found itself surrounded and cut off, outnumbered, exhausted, running out of water in summer heat. The situation was desperate in the precise military sense. No obvious route of escape, enemy forces closing in, the kind of crisis that ended in the annihilation of the surrounded unit. Then it rained. Not a gentle rain, a violent thunderstorm with lightning that struck the Germanic positions around the surrounded Romans. The rain gave the Roman soldiers water. The lightning disrupted the Germanic attack. The Roman unit broke out. The sources cannot agree on why it happened. Christian sources said it was the prayer of Christian soldiers in the unit, a miracle granted by the Christian God. Pagan sources credited Jupiter, the Roman sky god, responding to prayers from the traditional priests. Later sources attributed it to an Egyptian magician named Arnophis who allegedly accompanied the army and called down the storm through magical ritual. Marcus, in his official account, credited the gods generally, the traditional Roman formulation that covered all possibilities without committing to any single interpretation. What he actually thought he did not record. What he recorded, in the meditations, was that events outside your control are outside your control. That whether the rain came from Jupiter or Christ or Arnuphis or the ordinary meteorological patterns of Central Europe in summer was a question that could not be answered and therefore should not consume the attention that needed to go to things that could be answered. He thanked the gods. He moved on. The 11 years on the Danube cost Marcus Aurelius things that the philosophical framework could absorb but not eliminate. His health deteriorated. He had never been physically robust. The sources describe him as thin and careful about his diet, prone to illness, maintaining his physical condition through disciplined effort rather than natural constitution. The campaign conditions, the cold, the damp, the irregular food, the accumulated stress of command, wore him down in ways that became increasingly visible as the years passed. He continued taking the opium preparation that his physician Galen had prescribed years earlier for stomach pain. The meditations contain a reference to waking in the night unable to sleep, a detail that suggests the insomnia and physical discomfort that chronic pain produces. He managed it the way he managed everything, with the methodical application of available tools and the Stoic instruction not to complain about what couldn't be changed. Faustina died in 175. She had followed Marcus to the eastern frontier when he traveled there during the crisis of Avidius Cassius's rebellion, a detail that says something about their marriage that the hostile later sources try to obscure. She died in a small village in Asia Minor called Halala, of causes the sources describe vaguely as sudden illness. Marcus renamed the village Faustinopolis in her memory. He had her deified. He established a charity for orphan girls in her name. He wrote nothing in the meditations that directly records her death. He had been writing instructions to himself for decades. He had no instructions for this. 175 DC. Marcus was in the field on the Danube when the message arrived. Avidius Cassius, the general who had sacked Ctesiphon, who had won the Eastern War, who was the most celebrated military commander in the empire, had declared himself emperor. He had done it, the sources suggest, because a rumor had reached the east that Marcus Aurelius was dead, that the plague or the campaign or the accumulated weight of 15 years of governance had finally killed the philosopher-emperor. The rumor was false. Marcus was very much alive. He was also now facing a civil war on top of everything else. He set down his writing. He went east. What he did when he got there, how he responded to the man who had tried to take his throne, was the most purely Stoic act of his entire reign. And it was not what anyone expected.